Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this James Cooper Kreston Academy Update webinar. I hope it's bright and sunny where you are. Looking out the window here, it looks like a lovely day out there, so thank you very much for joining us. We've got a good mix of school business managers, governors and various other people on the webinar. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm Head of Charities and Education at James Cooper Kreston, and I'm joined by Darren O'Connor, who's Head of Academies at the firm. Both of us work with lots of academies. So this session is on the Kreston Academies Benchmarking Report for 2019, which was issued earlier this month. Hopefully most of you will have had a hard copy or a link to an email. It's not essential if you don't have access to the report that you have it for the webinar, but if you haven't got a copy and you'd like to receive one, do please contact us and we'll let you have one. We're intending to talk for around 30 minutes. There is the possibility for you to outline any questions you've got on your screen, and hopefully you will also have the slides in front of you. Right, so let's get started. So broadly, we'll be talking about the benchmarking report. This is the 8th year that we've done the report. We'll also pick up on a few sector issues along the way. I think it's fair to say some of the big issues, such as multi-academy trusts and pensions, we'll pick up as we go through the report. And today, B is for, the letter B stands for benchmark. There will be no mention of the other B word that we are hearing quite a bit about in the press at the moment. So this is a B. I won't mention the word, I won't mention it. Right, moving on. Highlights from the benchmarking report. One of the things that clearly came through was substantial funding concerns that people had, great deal of uncertainty. In terms of income per pupil, that remains broadly consistent with the previous year. I think we see that on average 50% of academies have an in-year deficit compared to 55% last year, so relatively stable, but there are huge variations across academies there. And I think it's fair to say that on average the deficits are slightly lower than last year. I think we see that academies have around 5 to 6 years of reserves remaining, which is a bit of an increase on the previous year. Staff costs at 72% of total costs remain much the same as last year, and of course there is the pensions time bomb, which we will cover in a bit more detail later. In terms of non-staff costs, there's little change there, and we'll consider what that means a bit later. And in terms of some themes relating to multi-academy trusts, the average cash balances in multi-academy trusts has gone up a bit from 1.7 to over 1.8 million. And interestingly, the average schools per multi-academy trust has risen from 3.5 to 5.6 in the last 2 years. And we are seeing some evidence that larger MATs are operating more efficiently. I think we've talked in previous years about the fact that there wasn't much evidence of MATs generating efficiency or other financial savings. Around 20% of MATs expect to add 5 or more schools in the next 12 months, which I think is an indicator that multi-academy trusts are going to get much bigger into the future. In terms of risks, one of the things we looked at was the question of what were the biggest risks for academies. I think the two biggest ones that came out were government funding and changes in pay and conditions. Of course, changes in pay and conditions does include the impact of pension changes. Interesting that educational standards and attainment are not in the top 2 risks for an academy. So third was the reduced pupil numbers. Fourth was the question of buildings, so the requirement for investment in buildings. And fifth was the risk relating to Ofsted inspections or poor exam results. So they were the key risks that our clients saw. Just a bit of background about where the information in the report comes from. It covers almost 1,000 schools across the country in around 350 trusts. So that's a mixture of multi-academy trusts and single academy trusts. It's based on the August 2018 accounts, so you will have submitted these, I'm sure, to the ESFA by the end of December. And the information is analysed by primary, secondary and multi-academy trusts. I think it's worth saying that if you are a multi-academy trust, it's always quite difficult to do comparisons with other multi-academy trusts because you do get a huge variation and a different mix. In terms of what you can do with the benchmarking report, I think that those of you that we'll hopefully see it's a reasonably readable document with lots of interesting ideas and not just a whole load of numbers. But in terms of what you can do with the financial information, it may be useful, for example, to do a comparison between your academy and the averages. I won't give you any answers, but it will perhaps stimulate thought as to why your figures may be different to others. So if we move on to a bit more of the detail, in terms of income, not surprisingly, we see that 95% of income is coming from central or local government. Around 72% of income is the general annual grant. Income per pupil is broadly consistent with the previous year, though what we have seen is a significant reduction in higher needs funding, and I think some schools have lost tens of thousands of pounds in situations where the local education authorities have passed on less money onto the schools. I think it's fair to say that additional income streams are negligible. Most of the additional income that's generated comes from renting out facilities, etc. We did talk last year about an increase in schools asking for parental contributions, but this is not a huge generator of income for your average academy. We are seeing some academies providing services to other schools, so this would include, for example, teaching schools, and some are providing some consultancy services to other schools. We are seeing a few schools opening nurseries where they're perhaps competing against local providers, but that can be something that is quite successful in generating revenue, although naturally it does carry with it some risks. And I think really the key emphasis here in terms of income tends to be around increasing pupil numbers, and I think one of the key factors there will be making sure that the educational performance of the school is strong in encouraging parents to send their children to your school. In terms of surpluses and deficits, this is quite a complex area, and people will calculate the deficits in different ways. Our section on the report covering this does explain how these things can be calculated. So often you see adjustments for depreciation, pensions and capital income. I think as some headline figures, 50% made the deficit, as we said earlier, during 2018, slightly down from the previous year. Though it's interesting to look at the 4-year trend there. So you'll see that in 2016, the number was 42%. Back in the halcyon days of 2015, only 21% of academies were making a deficit. If you look at the numbers after depreciation is included, a rather large number, 85% of academies are making a deficit. Some commentators would say it is appropriate to calculate these deficits after depreciation because at some stage in the future assets will actually need to be replaced, and of course depreciation is the spreading the cost of the fixed asset over their estimated life. So at some stage computers, buildings, etc. will likely wear out and require some sort of replacement. We have included in the slide the average surplus or deficit before depreciation, but including capital income in that slide, where you'll see some significant changes from the previous year. It's very hard to make generalizations about these numbers because there are significant variations between different schools, but we put the information there in case it's of interest, and I think there may be the odd occasional statistical blip. So for example, with Multi-Academy Trusts, we're showing an average surplus of 382,000. Last year it was 15, and then the previous year 705, so a huge amount of variations. And of course, one of the key issues here in terms of the numbers is the question of whether to join or form a multi-academy trust, particularly where you see the level of surplus that's being generated there. So just to encourage a bit of audience participation, we're going to run a poll now. So the question is, do you think joining a MAT will improve a school's finances? And the possible answers are yes, no, and don't know. So if you can briefly consider that and vote, and then we'll see what your thoughts are. So the votes are coming in. Just give you a few more seconds. Okay, so we'll close the poll now. So broadly, some interesting feedback. So around about 50% of you think that joining MAT will improve the school's finances. Around 30% say it doesn't, and around 20% aren't sure. So quite interesting, because I imagine that possibly that 50% figure in previous years would have been a bit less, and that may reflect the fact that an increasing number of you on the webinar have actually joined MAT since the previous year. Thanks very much for completing that. So we'll move on to Staff costs, as last year, staff costs consist of around 72% of total costs. I think pupil-teacher ratios are very similar to the previous year. We'll cover teachers' pensions costs a bit later, but those costs are up 40% in terms of the new contributions that will come in from September. We've seen quite a number of academies looking at restructuring, possibly in recruitment, going for slightly cheaper recruits, and a number have had redundancies. I think it's fair to say that anecdotally, more than average academies are looking at non-teaching staff more than teaching staff. We're seeing more and more people looking at teacher contact ratios, so the amount of time that teachers actually spend in the classroom, and people are monitoring those. We're seeing, and particularly in primary schools, learning support assistants being used more, and also more use of volunteers in classrooms. At secondary school level, we're seeing an increase in supply and agency costs, which perhaps reflects some recruitment and retention issues. And there is also a section in the report on the topic of heads and CEO salaries, which is a subject which, as you know, is often in the press, and the ESFA sent letters to academies where the figure is over 150,000. So there's some interesting information there. Moving on to non-staff costs, I think the conclusion that we came to in completing the report, that was probably many of the easy savings in non-staff costs have been made, and the costs are similar to the previous year. So we may be getting to a stage where it's quite difficult to make savings in non-staff costs. There's always the question of whether to outsource or not. I think we've seen an increasing number of people looking at taking back functions in-house that they previously might have outsourced. So this could be for a number of reasons, including, for example, costs and control of quality. I think we see generally across the piece a reduced maintenance spend, and I think evidence suggests in all property matters that a reduced maintenance spend is usually storing up a problem somewhere down the line. That may be months or years away, but often inadequate maintenance results in problems. We're seeing a continual increase in the number of schools taking out the RPA insurance, so it's 54% this year against 47% last year. Although interesting, I think insurance companies in the general market have possibly become more competitive in recent times in competition with the RPA. We're seeing emphasis on better procurement. The DFE has a number of national deals, so covering, for example, energy, water, printers, software, etc. And the school's buying strategy from the DFA, they've run a number of pilot schemes with the aim of potentially saving over £1 billion over the next couple of years. School Resource Management Advisors is a project run by the DFA under an initiative from Lord Agnew. They've looked at 72 schools and they reckon that they've identified possible savings of very significant sums around staffing, potential sales of land, catering, letting, insurance, etc. That process seems to have been wrapped up in a bit of mystery in recent times, so hopefully at some stage there will be some pronouncement as to what the potential savings are, so that schools can see whether there are things that they might be able to take advantage of. We move on to cash balances and reserves. Again, very hard to generalise. We put in there the average cash balances and what's called free rather than restricted reserves. So you'll see the balances are slightly down on average compared to the previous year. But I think it's fair to say that some academies have very low balances, and I think we are seeing more academies who are requesting support from the ESFA. Financial discipline and monitoring is important in these difficult times, as is the monitoring of cash flow. And of course, academies should be considering the reserves policies, either protecting the reserves that they have or using the reserves that they do have in a controlled way to make sure that their schools can operate effectively. So that's a broad summary for me and some of the key themes. I'll now hand over to Darren.
Thank you, Mike. So moving on to pensions, and firstly local government pension schemes. As a bit of background, the LGPS is known as a funded defined benefit pension scheme. And by this we mean that the actual deficit or surplus, if you're lucky enough, sits on your balance sheet. Although the pension deficit is still a significant number on most academies' balance sheets, on average we have seen a lower average closing pension deficit when compared to previous years. This is mainly due to the some would call it as a buoyant stock market, and also favourable changes in some of the assumptions that go in and the underlying assumptions to the pension liability. The last increase was back in 2017, and we're expecting the next contribution rate increase to be on or after April 2020. It's worth noting there's still significant differences in contribution rates across the sector depending on mainly geographic location, and this may be something that is revisited by the ESFA and local authorities over the next few years. Moving on to the teachers' pension scheme, so this is an unfunded defined benefit pension scheme, and by that it means that it's not recognised on your balance sheet, it's treated on a contributions basis. The big announcement that I'm sure all attendees are aware of is the significant increase in contribution rates from September 2019. To revisit the amounts again, the contribution rate will increase to 23.6 from what it currently stands at 16.48. Soon after the announcement, the ESFA have announced that they will fund the increase for at least the first year. Going forward after that, it's uncertain as to who will be picking up the tab, for want of a better word. You'll see that there's a graph that lists and represents the additional cost of the teachers' pension contribution rates. And on average, if you were to take a secondary school, we think the additional cost will be somewhere in the regions of 200,000. So moving to governance, the ESFA remains focused and determined to deliver the message that trustee oversight is of great importance. I mean, it's fair to say that the skills audits that most schools are or should be carrying out is a work in progress. Many have informally carried out such audits, but perhaps have not documented, and there's not a clear action plan as to how they will improve. So I think that's an area of recommendation for the year ahead. To fully document those skills audits. I mean, it's also fair to say that trustees are still not fully aware of their obligations and requirements as listed out in the Academy's financial handbook. And again, I would recommend this as an area you look at in the coming year. We've got up there the importance of KPIs. Trustees, we would encourage them always to ask for additional information, additional KPIs to help them make decisions and make informed decisions along the way. As well as asking for KPIs, you can use the benchmark report, which you should all hopefully have a copy of. And there's also the top 10 planning checks for governors, which is an ESFA document that should help guide you with your KPI understanding. Moving on to the next page, governance reviews, again similar to skills audits. I think a lot of trustees are aware of it and are informally reviewing it, but perhaps should put pen to paper on a more regular basis and ensure that they are identifying any areas of improvement and putting an action plan in place. Many academies continue to report vacancies within the trustee group, particularly where they're identified a gap in skills that they'd like to cover off. And perhaps that's why in the table below the average board size we see a general trend as a slimming down of the board. Of course, most trustees or all trustees are volunteers, and we rely on the goodwill of those individuals to take up those positions. On top of that, you've got the increase in scrutiny and complexity that is being delivered and handed down from the ESFA, and perhaps that's a reason why we do see a slight shortage in available and potential trustees. Induction process, we've noted that again in a number of cases we're seeing quite a light touch to the induction process, and again we would recommend this is an area that's reviewed. We see it as an easy win and an easy area where governance procedures can be improved by bringing in a robust induction process. Moving on to multi-academy trusts, As expected, maths are on the rise. In terms of new converting schools, we're seeing most will join a MAT that's already in existence, or will become a MAT along with a number of schools rather than actually setting out on their own as a single academy. Different MATs have different approaches to culture and strategy, and I think this is borne out in the way MATs are set up and the models that they adhere to. We see a number moving towards a more centralised system of financial control, albeit there are still some MATs that go down the decentralised routes. Interestingly, the benchmark report suggests that the more centralised MATs are benefiting from, on average, a smaller overall deficit or a greater overall surplus. This may be a result of size, because you typically find the larger MATs are the more centralised ones, and hopefully it demonstrates the benefits of economies of scale. In terms of other items, we'd just like to touch on from Multi-Academy Trusts. We've already talked about the difference in MAT models. Gag pooling, we're yet to see a significant uptake in this area, but just to recap, by gag pooling we mean that the trust receives the funding centrally and then allocates out individual budgets to schools based on needs of each individual school. From a logistical point of view, I think it makes sense, and it's much easier than to divert funds where they're needed, albeit local governing bodies are sometimes uneasy with this method, and there clearly is local, school and political factors that do need to be taken into account. We would expect over the coming years that we'll see more gag pooling, particularly as cost pressures are only likely to continue due to some of the issues we've already touched on. Moving to the two tables towards the bottom, I think we're seeing a convergence now in the way MATs are dealing with central services and the funding of central services. Most are now using a percentage of income as their bases, and then in terms of the top slice actual percentage, we see from the graph on the right hand side, generally speaking 4 or 5% seems to be the norm in the industry. Well, one thing we would say, although there does seem to be a convergence in how the central services are recharged, there is still a disparity in what each individual school is receiving in return for this central service, and it would be interesting to look at how that does develop over the coming years. So moving on to accounting systems, the last time we looked at this specifically was back in 2016, and FMS at that stage was the clear leader, being the local authority legacy system. Since then we've seen new entrants enter the market, notably HCSS, but also Sage Education. Before that, Sage was being used by some academies, typically because their business manager was used to using Sage in a previous life. But we are seeing now that Sage have developed a specific Sage Education package. As I say, we've seen these new entrants, but they're yet to have a significant impact. I think this is probably given that there's a significant cost associated with changing software provider, and perhaps that's why we haven't seen such a move in market share. One point to note is we're seeing a clear difference in software decision depending on whether you're a MAT or a SAT. Taking the MAT column on the right-hand graph, you'll see that PS Financials is by way is the clear market leader. Moving away from the not-for-profit sector, we're seeing a rise in the usage of QuickBooks and Xero and similar online cloud systems. It'll be interesting to see over time whether the sector takes on or shows an interest in this type of software. At the moment, this is not something that we are seeing. And the last point I'd just like to make on that is making tax digital, which I'm sure many of you on this webinar would have heard of before. If you're a significant sized MAT with a number of different trading income streams, you may have fully registered for VAT and therefore will need to be MTD compliant, making tax digital compliant. So you will need to ensure that your software is MTD compliant. Worth noting, for the avoidance of doubt, that all academies going through the VAT 126 route will not need to be MTD compliant. So finally, moving on to other sector issues. Back in 2018, at the time of the budget, the Chancellor announced an extra 400 million for capital funding within schools. About 3 weeks ago, the ESFA published the allocation per school. Payments should now have been received by each school, and at least that represents some good news in the sector. Moving on to the Dear Accounting Officer letters. There hasn't been any so far in 2019, so the last one was September 2018, which covered off some of the changes in the Academy's financial handbook, some of the new requirements around related party transactions, and also the ESFA's attitude towards excessive executive pay, which Mike touched on earlier. I won't go into too much detail on any of those because we have discussed them on previous webinars, but if you do have any comments or queries, please do get in contact with your usual James Cooper Kreston contact, or feel free to email Mike or me.
Thanks.
Finally, on energy price comparisons, the ESFA have recently sent out an update which includes a recommendation for the use of School Switch, a free online price comparison tool when comparing energy prices. The tool should hopefully remove the need for a broker and should then therefore hopefully reduce the overall energy cost or the associated fee cost to the school. If nothing else, it's another useful benchmarking tool along with some of the benchmarking exercises we've discussed here today. So that's everything from me, so thanks very much. I will hand back to Mike.
Thanks very much, Darren. So I think we're coming at 28 minutes, so there have been a few questions that have come through and observations which we'll just pick up on for those of you that have got the time. The first comment we've had through is more of an observation than a question. Somebody has said that yes to a MAT, but there are lots of depends. So I think that means that if you are considering joining or setting up a MAT, it's probably worth doing your investigation and due diligence at the start to make sure that it really is for you. Somebody's asked, is there any possibility of the teachers' pensions scheme contributions being changed or reversed? Darren, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. It obviously came as a shock, and as I'm sure we're aware, there was uproar within the sector. There has been further consultation, which could result in some changes, but I think the sceptic in me would say that the changes are likely to be around the edges rather than a significant change. So, in short, it's unlikely to see significant changes, and I think budgets and forecasts and so on should plan for the worst situation being the 23.6% contribution increase. Thanks,
Dan. I think it's fair to say that this TPS increases had a big impact on the independent school sector as well, and many independent schools are considering the possibility. I'm sure it will be a long process of possibly coming out of the teachers' pension scheme and coming up with an alternative scheme, but of course that route isn't available for academies. Somebody asked, have you analysed the staff cost percentage by geographical area? Specifically, is the ratio higher in the Shire counties where the AWPU is fairly low but the cost of living is high? AWPU is the age-weighted pupil unit, which is the rate local authorities set to allocate entitlement for funding for 316s. I mean, the information in our survey is very much a sort of a national result rather than specifically looking at regional areas. We have in the past occasionally done benchmarking reports looking at small geographical areas to do comparisons between schools, so that is potentially worth considering. You know, for example, if you pick out 10 similar schools in your geographical area, looking at a bit more detail at the numbers. Someone has asked whether it's possible to clarify the recommended level of reserves that a large secondary school should carry and a large secondary school in a MAT trust with a small primary school. Can you provide this as a percentage of total expenditure? The person says, I appreciate that this is very hard. I suppose it is a very difficult question. I think if you look beyond the academy sector at the wider charity sector, you'll see that the level of reserves that charities own varies hugely between charities that have no reserves whatsoever up to the RNLI, which has reserves of about 3.5 years of expenditure. So I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of academies probably have insufficient reserves for organisations of their size. So it's a question of not enough rather than too many. Darren mentioned in his section the question of gag pooling, where in a multi-academy trust it's possible for schools to pool their resources. That may be a measure which might be quite useful for some academies, in the sense that you can offset academies which have a significant surplus with ones perhaps not so strong. But again, as Darren said, there's some quite difficult political issues in terms of pooling. And someone's asked, do you have any information on the amount of income raised from voluntary contributions from parents? I think it's fair to say there that it's not really widespread, but it's a good question and something I think we might consider including in the survey next year. I think it's fair to say that contributions from parents tend to be successful in prosperous areas where perhaps there are very high performing in terms of educational results, grammar schools, where perhaps for wealthier parents there is a choice between the independent schools and a high performing state school, and those parents may well be prepared to make significant parental contributions. At the other end of the scale, you have some schools which take just a firm view that they will not accept or certainly not ask for parental contributions because they just feel that is not the right thing to be doing.
Agreed, and yes, it may be something we can look at in the future.
So I think that is actually there's one other question which has come through, which is a question of, someone said when we were discussing the risks that academies face, that they were surprised to see that retention and recruitment of staff wasn't mentioned. Interestingly, this came in at 6th on the list. I think we listed the top 5. I suppose this question arises due to the perceived recruitment and retention crisis for teachers. But I think one observation on the risks is that the risks that we looked at earlier, there's a very strong financial focus on those risks, which perhaps suggests that the sector has become, perhaps just as a result of circumstance, very focused on finances, where of course the true focus of schools, I think most would argue, would be on educational attainment. So I think that's the end of the questions. So just like to thank Darren for joining me, and thanking you all for joining us, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.